one of the things that comes up a lot is that we frequently talk about agents and what they're doing, and we come up with these great AI use cases, and some, to be frank, are a little grandiose. In fact, I'll pick on some of my cohorts from last year's event. We were talking about using AI to find whales, which, look, it's nice and it makes you feel good and it's exciting, but let's be frank, in everyone's organization, how many of you are finding whales with AI? So the reality is that when we get to the enterprise use of AI, the enterprise use of AI is a little more boring, but it's all the more important because when we talk about where AI will really pick up and where it will have a profound impact on what we're doing, that's where it's going to show up. So let's double click on that a little bit and talk about how enterprises are using this and how this is crossing in with sort of non-AI pieces, because at the end of the day, the agent doesn't work alone. It works in concert with a broad ecosystem of tools and other products. So with that, so for the last week, if you've been following the market, you know that it's been nothing but sunshine and roses for AI stocks, all right? And what we're seeing is that feedback that says, look, we've been talking a lot about all of the potential that AI has. We're seeing all of this stuff, but is it really turning around and giving us the returns that we're expecting? And the reality is that when you speak to a lot of organizations, what they quickly come back with is, you know, we installed a Copilot and we had a chat bot or we had this piece or that piece. It was useful, but it hit a wall. And at some point, it was not delivering the returns that we were expecting because it answered a question, but what I really wanted it to do was the work. And so when you get to the work, enterprises are doing a lot of the same things over and over again. What you start seeing are these common themes that show up in use cases. Take, for example, anybody who's manufacturing things. How do you handle an order? Well, it turns out that is a cross-functional, huge effort that spans a lot of different things. Everything from how you process a purchase order, to how you figure out the taxes, to how you manage your inventory, to turning around and figuring out logistics for how you're going to actually ship it. And then when you update those finances, how are you actually reporting the finances? Where is it being reported? What are the reports that are getting generated? So it's a wide range of these different use cases. But when we talk about using agents in this context, what does an agent actually look like? Probably the most interesting event that I attended this last year. I'm sorry, Mahan, this event is exciting. But this other event was kind of interesting. And the reason why it was more interesting is I literally had it was a room full of CIOs, right? And so my lunch table had 10 CIOs on it. Had never met them before. I was not allowed to sell to them. And that was the sole purpose why I was there. So I threw out the question. I said, how many of you have actually seen an agent? And I suddenly had 10 CIOs huddled around my laptop because it was the first time they were seeing it. And so I encourage all of you, because you're practitioners, you know this stuff, you actually use this stuff. I want you to go around and actually show people what is underneath the covers. Let's unmask this. Let's share what's the goodness there. So to do that, I'm going to take a simple example. And this, believe it or not, this wall of text is a simple one. We want to go and help a teacher create a lesson plan. On the surface, we would think, okay, you just have a prompt there. Create me a lesson plan on this topic. But anyone who's actually gone and created a lesson plan before very quickly will come back and tell you, but who's my audience? Am I teaching this to a 5-year-old or am I teaching this to an adult? How much do they already know? What is the context? What are the tools I have available in terms of teaching aids? These all start to matter. So when you start dissecting what actually has to go into a prompt, it includes all of the job description that you need that agent to have. So everything from the core task, we're going to create a lesson plan around this, to how do I go and find the additional information if I don't have it already? So what are the tools that are available to me? How do I take that and get the desired results, and what format should the desired results be in? And then finally, what are the exceptions, right? Make sure that we're not breaking the rules. We want certain rules to get followed over and over again. And then we go and we throw it a user prompt. So we say, I've got a user, or I've got a student, his name is Ford, and he needs a lesson plan, but you'll notice we're missing all of the context we need in order to create a good lesson plan. So what do we get back? We get back all of the information that the agent needs in order to complete this. So you start seeing that agents are actually taking iterations over and over again to say, well, if I'm missing context, how do I get the context? And then once I have the context, how do I do the work? And that series of steps can actually go on for much longer than 1 or 2 steps. Here, we're creating a lesson plan, so the first thing it's going to do is say, give me the context and I'll give you a lesson plan. So if I have the context, so I've got a student named Justin, that Justin is in grade 10, doesn't have any education issues, and they don't have any learning aids available. Well, here's a lesson plan for that. So the same agent is producing 2 wildly different results. One is saying, give me more information. The other one is then going and actually producing a result. When it asks for more information, who's actually getting that additional information? Now, if you've been using something like Claude and you ask it a question, tell me about my email. Claude, I actually asked it, I said, tell me what emails am I ignoring? And Claude gave me a lecture on how I'm ignoring certain tasks, right? Creating this presentation being one of them. So, but it is an iterative series of steps. It went and it fetched Gmail for me. It went and it did the analysis for me. Then it came back and did an assessment for me. It did all of those things by itself, but a lot of times we want really tight controls over how that works. So what we end up doing is tying it into a process. And this is how a lot of enterprises will actually execute agents. They will go and use a process orchestrator to go and weave together a series of tasks. Everything from how do I go and read a document that's on paper, scan it, OCR it, et cetera. There are certain tasks that are going to be very predictable. I don't need AI for that. We've been doing these task automations for a long time. Anybody who's created a report in Salesforce, and I wish you the best having gone through that experience, anybody who's created this report in Salesforce knows this is a task. It's the same results over and over again. I just need to go and parse out the data. And then there's times when I actually need cognitive skill. That's where the agents come in. This is historically the place where process orchestration actually stops. And it actually has to break out and engage with users and ask for a bunch of context or inputs or say, assess this and tell me what you want me to do next. And then finally, this can turn around and call other processes. So you can layer processes on top of one another. When you actually go and start looking at what enterprise processes look like, it's a lot of this. And it is as riveting as it sounds, but this is the foundation for how organizations work, especially when they're working at scale. So let's take a couple of examples here. The first example I want to do is, and this came from a real petrochemical company. They were looking at literally tens of thousands of transactions every quarter. And in those transactions, they had to figure out what was the tax treatment on that. So when they had to look at that tax treatment, they needed to go and take a transaction. The format of all the transactions were not the same. They carried different kinds of information per transaction. The types of transactions they would do would change from quarter to quarter. Well, they didn't want to code all of that up, so they used a document extraction tool for being able to do that, a little generative AI in that piece, and they asked it questions and they were able to get the information they wanted. Asking a document questions, that's AI 101. But then they asked it something that agents are really good at. They said, well, here's the tax code. It's 1,000 pages of rules. Go and tell me how this transaction applies to this set of rules and what rules do I use for determining what transactions I want to actually tax and how I want that tax treatment to work. Add the result into a tracking spreadsheet and then give it to a human to double check, right? This is something that is a basic use case that you will see over and over again. I have a big set of rules. How do I go and figure out what rule applies? Another example, and this is another real example that came from a company that is in the entertainment space. As we've been following, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, and statistically most of you are because you are at a conference on AI. Paramount has been changing hands, and there's new owners, and now Amazon is looking at buying another company, and it is a mess. Following who is your competitor in the entertainment space literally changes quarter by quarter. So I can't give a automation tool a list of competitors and say, go check them, because it literally won't stay the same. So now I use agents to go and say, well, I want you to go and read the news, follow all of this M&A notice, mergers and acquisitions, and I want you to figure out who my competitors are. Based on that, I want you to pull their SEC filings. The SEC filings are predictive. I know that's a common task. I'm going to use that task every time. They are well formatted. I know how to read that. And then I want you to extract out what are the risks that each one is identifying. Every SEC filing has a section for risks, but risks might be implicit elsewhere in the document. So the risk might be, we're getting sued, but the actual risk might be in the financials somewhere later, and an agent can be really great at helping you find those. Summarizing those and then preparing a report for a CFO so they can find out how do we want to set ourselves up and how do we want to tell our story to the street about how our financials look and what our risks look like. Another common use case is something like assessing if something's fraudulent. Insurance companies deal with millions of claims a year. When you're dealing with high volume amounts of claims, the challenge you very quickly run into is, well, not all claims are risks of fraud. And I want to score that. But that requires a lot of context. This is another place where historically we've needed a lot of human help, but the agent can help us with some common sense, a little bit of, hey, here's a set of guidelines, but the guidelines are squishy. Help me make this assessment. So we're going to be able to go and take the claim. We're going to say, let's pull the client information, and based on the context of those two things, assess a risk score. So if a claim comes in, adult male, 51 years old, has a small fender bender, chances, has not made a claim in years. Chances of fraud, low. Then there's that 51-year-old's 19-year-old son who's in college and is implicitly a risk he's a risk to all of you on the roads, right? That person is, they've been filing more claims because they have a little zooty sports car and they want to drive it fast. That person is going to have a risk associated with that. And now I want to go and say, let's check that for fraud. So the context now starts to matter, but that 19-year-old being the child of that 51-year-old is less likely than, say, a 19-year-old who's the child of somebody who does have a bad history. So suddenly, how the AI agent will be able to make that assessment changes what that looks like. Great example of a place where agents can make soft decisions that historically just a list of rules cannot. Business logic alone would never have solved this. Contract handling. Contract handling is something that organizations do all the time. So we had some questions earlier about B2B. When you've got B2B activity, you sometimes get into customers who are literally transacting millions of dollars per transaction. Now, when we sign up for a $50 product, so we're using some Office suite or something like that, we get an end user license agreement. We, as a $50 customer, do not have the means to be able to negotiate the terms and conditions of how we use that software. We have to accept what's given to us. When you fork over a couple $1,000,000, suddenly you get to negotiate terms and conditions. So that whole cycle of how you handle contracts, I want to go and evaluate this contract. Did the other person change any of the indemnity clauses? If they changed the indemnity clause, I need to look at those changes and whether or not those changes follow our guidelines. It's another circumstance where the rules are a little bit squishy. There's some changes that you might be okay with from an indemnity perspective, but a lot of changes that you're not going to be. Redline appropriately, and then go through that loop where you're sending emails back to the other side as well as putting it through human review. You can now get through contracts a lot faster, which at the end of a quarter, when suddenly a bunch of stuff comes in the last 2 or 3 days, you have a lot faster way of getting through them than you would have beforehand. I'm going to wrap with this last piece. And again, it's another ask for all of you. Up until now, I've been talking about hey, if there's a mistake, you can kind of come back and you can make a case for your mistake, especially in a B2B case. We're going to see more and more use of AI actually affecting people's lives. And when those cases come up, I need all of you to be the strong advocates in the room, especially the folks who may not appreciate that AI is it's kind of ready, but it still needs adult supervision, right? We let our kids ride a skateboard, but we still put a helmet on them and watch them when they go to the skate park. AI is at the skate park phase of its life. We need the humans in the loop because business users want to go and start doing scary things like saying prior authorization in healthcare. I'm not a fan of this one, right? I'm an old fart. I'm going to have to start dealing with stuff like this, and I don't want AI making that decision for me. But this is one of those things where in a real life circumstance, we're going to run into circumstances where we're going to extract information, we're going to review the request against regulatory requirements. What do I have to do as an insurance company? Then I'm going to do the squishy stuff like, well, what are my guidelines? And then I might have a second set of guidelines of how do I say no? And this is the place where we, as people who understand AI can step in and say, hey, that could get it wrong. And if it gets it wrong, it's going to forget looking bad. You're going to actually potentially kill somebody. Let's keep the human in the loop before we go and send that back. So, I don't mean to end on a little bit of a dour note, but when we do talk about AI in the enterprise, this is the stuff that's going to start coming up more and more, especially in the coming years when organizations are looking for that next wave of ROI. And before we jump on that ROI bandwagon, let's make sure that we've put a helmet on the skateboarder and we're keeping an eye on them. And so with that, I will wrap this up. Last few takeaways, co-pilots were good, maybe not the home run we were looking for. We're definitely seeing that shift towards agents, and I don't think that's a surprise to anybody here. Don't forget that agents don't live in isolation. They live in concert with a degree of automation. So pay attention to process orchestrators out there like Temporal. What is happening with task automation and the tools that are around that. And then finally, please, 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 let's keep some humans in the loop. With that, any questions?
I just have a comment. I think it's important that a point you made about keeping humans in the loop, because a lot of people are concerned about jobs disappearing, but the reality is humans have to be part of this loop and for it to be successful. So thank you for sharing that, because a lot of people are really concerned about still being of value in the process with AI.
I think everyone's concerned about that, and rightfully so. And this is why, where this audience in particular, you are all in a position to have that impact and make sure that we're making sensible decisions. Thank you. Is there anyone else with a question?
Right here. Regarding the human in the loop, in the enterprise, normally, let's say IT would develop a solution. The human in the loop has the domain knowledge, not IT, right? So with AI, I imagine it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. For that matter, can we look at AI as a step in the whole process? So the AI will process, and there is an interim output that the human in the loop would be the domain expert will come in and review. Is that enough? The static flow like that, is that enough? Or do you mean human in the loop the whole way, every step of the way?
That's a great question. So there's going to be points in a process where human in the loop evaluation is prudent. And because there's also places where it's a lot of task automation. In task automation, it's going to produce the same predictable outcome every time. You follow a set of business logic, it's going to do the same thing, right? Adding a bunch of results from end of quarter purchases, we're going to get predictable output with that. I don't have to worry about the computer making a wrong decision there. Where there's an AI step or a series of steps, I may need to insert a human at that point. And And then also the one last thing on the automation front. You mentioned automation. Automation is going to be a factor with this, whether we see that in form of Python because we're just directly using LangChain, or we see this in terms of one of those no-code, low-code tools like, my former employer, Automation Anywhere. They make a great one. All right, so I might be mildly biased towards that, but that would be an example of where you would actually putting some of the also business knowledge into the process of building the agent.
Thank you for sharing this. This was very compelling use cases of the agentic AI. I have a sort of a business-related question. As a product leader, where do you think kind of the moat resides in for those of us who are building these agentic AIs? You spoke early on about revealing the prompts to the CIO. So I'm kind of curious how you think about where that, if you were to build something for an enterprise, where as a business your moat lies?
Are you thinking in terms of like you're building enterprise software and that enterprise software has... So in a circumstance where you are building an application and the application has agents embedded with it, it is not expected that you're going to be sharing your prompt as much as you won't be sharing your source code, right? Assuming you're not building an open source product. In that case, you will be challenged by an AI governance team that is checking all of the applications that are coming in, claiming some kind of AI capability, and they will quiz you on your use of AI, how it's getting engaged, and whatnot. The moat piece is where you get, how do I stand out competitively? Is it easy for somebody to copy my prompts? And the reality is that the moats are tending to get a little bit smaller here, where before I could build some piece of intellectual property that was really difficult to copy. There was some insight in that was hard to do. With AI, those insights are nowhere near as the chasm there isn't nearly as large. And so you're seeing people come and use agents to get into markets and move a lot faster. Pick on not Salesforce, but ServiceNow as an example. ServiceNow went and jumped into a whole new market and very quickly put together a market offering that was competitive in that space, but it took them a lot less time to do it than the other players in the market who had been there for 10, 15 years had taken. And agents had a lot to do with that. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.